It's GSX front subframe installation day today. This is the original 2G front subframe that I had Detective Coating do an incredible job cleaning up and applying pounds and pounds of powder to, apparently. This is the one. But like any other part that goes through powder coating, there's additional cleanup that you have to do to make everything fit back together right. And that's what I get to bring to you first. I can't believe how well all this turned out. But you can tell the first thing that I wanted out of the way is cleaning out all the bolt holes with the thread chaser kit. There were only two holes that I had to lightly use a tap on before finishing them up with the chase, get them all ready for the bolts they're about to receive, but my mission here was overall successful. All the holes for the steering rack, the front sway bar, lower trailing arms, and other plates and subframe members, they all came out just fine. I've done my due diligence paying these forward, enough of this silliness. My real goal is to install these Volk Metalcraft 2G aluminum front subframe bushings, however I have to do it. It's an interference fit with only a difference in materials determining who wins. I've read a post about the process and I'm fairly resolved that I'll have to use a hydraulic press for this. I want to take some measurements though to see how effective a freezer is with an aluminum bushing. We already saw how it helped with a rubber bushing, but I want to know. I've got the 1-inch mic here, so it's 1.3 and that's only one tick past it, so there's 25 thousandths plus 21 is 1.346. You get the last number around the barrel, and if the indicator line lands directly on the last thousandth and lines up on the zero on the opposite side of the barrel, that's dead nuts 1.3460 for this bushing. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the rest of these just for giggles. I started using these micrometers only because I left my digital calipers at home, but I'm glad I did that actually. These are orders of magnitude more accurate than digital calipers are for this example. There's a whole lot I still have to do before I can drive them in though. I can't just freeze them. That ain't going to cut it. The powder coating on this subframe will never let me install these bushings successfully. The bushing bosses were all coated, which would have been fine with a rubber bushing. If I were installing a rubber bushing, I'd actually want them to be that way. But for an aluminum bushing, I have to remove all of it because it's going to stop my efforts dead in their tracks. I have to get all this down to the bare metal again in order for any of the rest of the other magic to work. For now, I'm going to throw these aluminum subframe bushings into the freezer for science, and while those freeze, I'm going to go to work cleaning out the bosses. Powder coating like this is next level, and I tried to use a coarse buff thinking it's going to get me somewhere, but it's just way too soft. This coating just laughed it off. Said nah. I needed to use something much more aggressive. Sandpaper drums on a Dremel is what it actually took. It didn't take very long to get down to bare metal with this, only 3 hours total, but that's including polishing them back up to shiny bare metal again with the coarse buff once I was done sanding for all 6 holes. Seriously, this really did take a long time to do. It's one hell of a powder coating job. Between blasted off corrosion, slag or grape shot from welding or other imperfections in manufacturing, in order for you to install aluminum subframe bushings, you're going to have to clean this up either way, even if you didn't bother with any powder coating at all. Cleaning up all these holes you're installing these bushings into is a necessity if you're using aluminum subframe bushings. Spend the time this takes, but that's not going to make these bushings fit all by itself either. Once I'm done cleaning and polishing each boss, I smear a layer of dielectric grease onto the freshly polished steel. This is just intended to act as a moisture barrier to keep it from rusting because this grease is waterproof. But it's also nice as it's going to act as lubricant for the bushings while they're being pressed in. You're not going to be able to use a ball joint press or a bushing press to pull this installation off. This requires much more tonnage. Once you press these bushings in, they're actually going to stretch the steel around it and make the hole perfectly round. They won't be loose, nor will they rattle. They are not going to fall out. I want to measure them frozen. They've been in here for 3 days. I'm sure they'd freeze in a couple of hours, but this is for science. I wanted to make sure they were fully frozen before I do this next test. I'll spare you reading the mics. Hopefully after 16 years of YouTubing, you trust that I know how to read them properly. I'm writing all this down and saving you all that time because I'm just trying to measure what your freezer will do so you can quantify doing this before you try to do it. You'll be lucky to get your parts down to 29 to 30 degrees F or just a tad below 0 C, but they're going to begin warming up rapidly the moment it's pulled out of the freezer. But what's a freezer really? Something that's going to drop the temperature about 50 degrees F at best from room temperature? In order to make a real difference, you need to make more than a 100-degree Fahrenheit differential. And that's why I've got this cooler full of dry ice for a really deep freeze. Dry ice that you get from a grocery store can get down to about 20 to 40 degrees below zero, whether we're talking about Fahrenheit or Celsius. Both scales kind of meet up at minus 40. But anyway, freezing a thing with dry ice is enough to give you that more than 100-degree differential that you're looking for. Heating the other part to expand it gives an even greater advantage. The coldest I could get my digital thermometer to register was minus 27°F, which is plenty cold inside the cooler. Froze these things for about an hour, and they were frozen to begin with, but now I'm going to pull one out and measure it as quickly as I can. It's cold enough to burn your skin in seconds, but as it warms up, it gets bigger. So I'm right on that measurement. Freezing these things for installation is not enough, though, not by itself. I'm demonstrating that you should use every single advantage available to you when installing aluminum bushings. Measuring this after it was exposed to room temperature for about a minute now has it just barely below freezing, so you can see in a minute of measuring and hammering that it came up 20 degrees. Aluminum is a potent heat sink. It comes up quick, so the advantage that you get doesn't really last very long. But if you work fast, it might help you get it started. And sometimes that's all the help you need, because it really is the hardest part of doing this. Let's get right to the numbers, shall we? Aluminum parts between 1.3 and 1.9 inches thick show a relative difference of 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch, or 8 to 12 hundredths of a millimeter, when you can drop their core temperatures by over 100 degrees. So 1 to 1.5 thousandths of an inch per inch of material per 100 degrees is what you should discover. That's what we see right here. Different materials have different thermal properties, but there's the advantage right there. I tried pulling one out that was freshly frozen from the cooler and showing you the temperature, and I got it minus 15°F when I aimed it down inside the hole, but I totally failed at making the camera see the tool. I'm just letting you know, that's about as good as I could do. I'm going to put all these back on dry ice for another hour and then try to install them. I'm going to use this time to gather my tools, and oops, one's already installed. I gave it some solid hammer smacks after the press to make sure it was fully seated, but I struggled hard on that press. So focused on what I was doing instead of what the camera was doing. I did everything I could, and it took me a long time. It's a shame I missed that, because the next scene shouldn't have even been able to stick to the memory card. The way this giant part's shaped and doing this in a cramped corner, there's just no way to get me that shot, you know. The only thing letting me do this on the press by myself is this $25 Harbor Freight 200-pound capacity portable work stand. You only catch glimpses of it here and there, but it's there. It gave me a thing that I could adjust the height of so that I could keep this heavy part level. Something to support the weight opposite of where I was doing all my rigging and pressing, but something that's flimsy enough to give. If I'm off by a little and the press bottoms out on the parts and it gets kind of cockeyed, it's going to give under pressure rather than the subframe. And that's something you got to think about, because you can destroy your subframe if you bend it, so you have to be extremely careful while you're doing this with 20 tons. Do not press against the leading edge of the bosses. Brace around the edges or you'll mangle that boss. And if you can't do that, use something that's flat and bigger than the boss. Here's a whole scene from the start. Finally, I heated the hole for the same reason I put the deep freeze on those bushings. All that money for dry ice and the time spent freezing parts, cleaning and greasing holes, it all boils down to only a brief moment of advantage just to get that bushing started. You'll see it flash over above the freezing point very quickly, but you've got one shot at getting this right. Time 6. No pressure. A 20-ton press can do the rest from there, and there's plenty of potential to screw that up too, so never hesitate to stop and double-check your rigging. Just question what's going on and look all around it. Keep the subframe member off the frame of the press while you're doing this. I just showed everything short of modifying the bushings that you can do to make it easier on yourself, but this is an advanced level job. If you don't trust yourself or your rigging enough to not destroy it, then get help. Pay close attention to your rigging to ensure that it doesn't shift under load, because that's when things get destroyed real quick and the pain train rolls in. And now it's confession bear time. Half of the advice I just gave you came from my experience from making this video, and from my mistakes. This was uncharted territory for me. I gouged the subframe in a couple of spots, and some of the hammering I did released blasting media from the spot welded sections of the subframe into my moving blanketed table without me seeing it happen. And when I flipped the subframe over to work on the other side, that media on the black blanket scuffed a few areas on my beautiful powder-coated subframe. Neither the gouging nor the scratches could penetrate all the way through a finish like this, but more than the powder coating got damaged from installing these things. The lesson here is probably press your aluminum subframe bushings in before you get it powder coated. And I want to add that everything that went wrong here was only and always my fault. Yeah, I bent the top of that one too. It's something that I could take a lot of time and effort to correct, except that it doesn't interfere with anything at all. That's for a rubber bushing that I no longer use nor need because of the aluminum spacers that go on top of these bushings. Nothing interferes, and though I dinged the top of the bushing that went in perfectly, here on this side the spacer still fits perfectly without any slop. So we're good there too, but you see here I didn't bend this one at all. I used a smaller diameter piece on top to press against. The nick on the bushing came from the edge of the smaller socket that I used to brace it with, but it's tiny, and like I said, the spacer fits it perfectly, so this one's good. This one came out perfect. Same goes for this one here. And this one too. If you forgive my previous bushing nick, then that's 4 good ones in a row without any damage. But then there's this one. The first one that I failed to film the first half hour as I destroyed it. The bushing was 90% of the way in when I discovered that the boss got mangled because my rigging shifted. And that's also when I discovered the camera wasn't rolling. But by then, it wasn't coming back out. So I went to the bench and I used a cutoff wheel with a Dremel around the inside edge of the boss to open it back up again so I could mash it through the rest of the way. The outside of the bushing boss turned out far worse than the installation itself because of how much force had to be applied to both discover the problem and to fix it. But what do you expect from 20 tons of force on a press?
It just so turns out that this Mitsubishi specialty tool happens to fit directly around the bushing.
Like maybe with a 0.5 millimeters clearance. And I took advantage of that wonderful convenience by putting this in the press on top of the pinion centering spacer piece that's not used in the kit for a Mitsubishi to brace the bottom of the bushing. Without the first half hour of video, the only thing that I can guess went wrong is the subframe contacted the press frame as the bushing was, coming under load, preventing it from pressing the bushing in straight. As it advanced, it only got worse, but it bent the boss that was, only halfway welded to the subframe, and I'll show you that. There's a logical explanation for this regarding where the robot can reach and even weld. If you look closely at the subframe holes where the bolt bosses or the bushing bosses are all welded in, the robot only welded halfway around it because it couldn't reach the back side of the thing to weld it. One side of this bushing was welded poorly, and it's because it was nestled into a corner. Since it wasn't fully supported all the way around, it ripped out and went the direction it most easily could under all that load. And it didn't just tweak the boss, it actually bent my subframe too. It pushed both the bushing boss and the trailing passenger leg about 3/16 of an inch out of center by the time I straightened that boss back out again. To correct that, I just use these turnbuckles, available at your local hardware store for around 15 bucks. With a few spare bolts, I was able to find bolt holes on either side of the areas of the subframe that I needed to move, sized these things to either brace or pull, or even sometimes do both simultaneously to move the subframe back into position and level it again. And I'm proud to tell you that I can now hand thread the old bolts right back through the bushing into the body holes without lube or even the slightest hint of hole preparation. I got it that straight. It sits flat and flush when you set it down on a flat surface now, and it'll slide on and off of the studs. And with a fit like that, obviously I got her all sorted out now. So to make sure it stays like that, I'm going to hand this off to Matt. I ground off just enough material on the coating to give Matt room right where he needed it to work. He's going to use the TIG, so he doesn't really need much room, just enough not to contaminate the weld. Heat will burn off some of the material that surrounds the weld, and nothing I can do about that. That just goes with the territory. It probably would have held just fine if I didn't weld it, but it moved once, and metal remembers doing stuff like that. I don't want it to ever relive any of those old memories. And if I bent it back in shape and left it alone, it would also be the first place that this thing would rust. Matt doesn't just weld better than Mitsubishi robots. His capabilities that he's brought to this channel speak for themselves. It's why I'm not afraid to screw up while installing my subframe bushings. You watched him bail me out over a half dozen times so far. The turnbuckles were even his idea too, and it worked. Matt's always willing to help, and he's full of good ideas. I'm extremely grateful for all of that. It looks pretty bad, pretty blistered and burnt. Some of the powder coat let go, and there's 2 very distinct layers of it. Something I'm really happy about, actually. Most of it's on the outer layer that's separated, but some of it cracked and raised. I think you'll be surprised by how resilient this finish actually is. Of course, blending powder coating is not a thing, but I'll still need to protect the areas where all of it left apart, because if I didn't, well, then it's going to rust from the outside in and compromise its integrity. But I'm going to do that part last. To begin repairing this finish, I start with a dry, clean microfiber towel to wipe and buff away all foreign material from the coating. You don't need to use solvents for powder coat, but soapy water can help if it's really bad. My coating's so fresh I don't need all that. With the coating cleaned up, it's easier to see all the spots that I need to address. There were spots that got scratched and scuffed, even a couple of unfortunate spots that got chipped. I like the dual layer coating because you can barely tell on the few little spots here or there where I lost one of those layers. But to smooth all this out, I use a heat gun. Heat cures powder coating, but it also softens it. It shrinks plastic. The glossy finish is created by surface tension when the powder coat is liquefied by heat and then shrinks as it cools. So reheating the coating with a heat gun makes it soft enough to kind of wake that back up again. The goal isn't to liquefy the powder coat again. You don't want to get it anywhere near that hot, and it's not going to let you. It's going to bubble and peel off long before then if you try to do that. Keep the heat gun moving and watch it. Buff behind it to prevent it from bubbling. You just want to get it hot enough to soften so that you can buff it smooth again with a microfiber towel. Most of that light scratching is going to disappear on its own from the heat. The massaging part's only necessary to ensure that the hot coating stays stuck on the part. When you apply the heat to plastic, it shrinks. Powder coat is a polymer. It's no different. Most of the loose areas shrunk back down and stuck to the previous layer. The worst spot is the back top passenger side edge, where it appears to have something embedded in that finish. So if anything got embedded in your powder coat, the heat gun's not going to remove it. Buffing might, but what's really going to give you the best shot of removing it is a polish formulated for your finish. It won't fill chips back in or smear cured powder coat back over the sections that got burned off, but it might polish out or reduce what remains of your scratches while it removes the embedded material. Aluminum polish can work to do this, but I wanted to try this Eastwood powder coat polish and see what it does. Take some of my advice that I actually give for once, I guess. I've always used Blue Magic metal polish for this, and I would have done it again if it
wasn't for those meddling kids.
If I didn't have this. Either one's abrasive, but they're abrasive in all the right ways. I smeared it on cold and obviously way too thick, but you want to massage this stuff in until it all disappears, and then go back over it again with a clean dry microfiber cloth to buff it. I did it cold, and I'll tell you right now that I got much better results after a second pass when I heated it up with the heat gun first. Combine the two together and it'll do a better job. Just make sure you remove all of it long before the part completely cools off. For the chipped areas, I don't really have any other choice than to use a tough paint-like sealant. I went with VHT chassis and roll bar paint because it's an epoxy coating, not a lacquer paint. It's chemical, corrosion, and rust resistant, and it can be applied to bare metal without a primer. If any of the cracked powder coat layers didn't stick back down with the heat gun, they're going to stick right back down again because of this epoxy, and it's going to creep into those cracks while the paint is wet and thin, and it's going to dry glossy. I'd go ahead and install this thing, except that I'm still waiting for parts that I ordered in the previous video. I said not to worry, that it would fit my production schedule, and so far it has, because I have things like this clean room to work on to get ready for future videos with. Oh, a dirty old clean room. Time-consuming things that I don't want to film and edit. No sooner did I get it skinned than the first half of my parts arrived. Not everything in this order is for the front subframe, but neither is the other half of everything I need in this order. My parts had to come from 2 different countries, so hopefully inside this thing I find what I'm looking for. I'm not assembling this thing on my workbench or on the floor this time. The GSX is on a lift where we can see it and easily work on it, so this time I'm doing it on the lift. The front subframe member is the most central foundation for everything else that follows, so I'm installing it and building out from there. And I hit the jackpot, fellas. 2 brand new front subframe bolts. The other 4 mounts just get nuts and washers, and I have those. But one of these bolts was in really rough shape, too rough to use, and I found a spare one in my pile of bolts, but I noticed that they were different grades. These are 7s. I believe the other grade 10 bolt that I found was from a differential mount, but there you go. They met my production schedule. I've got the right bolts I need to install the subframe, and now I can get back to doing that. Because the 4 studs protruding from the chassis for the front subframe are captive studs, I have to bring the wire wheel over to the studs. These are actually in really good shape, surface rust only. A couple of scratches on the painted sections, but so what? Gonna grease them for now to make the body guy angry, because he's not gonna like that at all. And you don't need to use anti-seize here, but I recommend some kind of outer sealant or wax once the final assembly is complete to prevent future rust problems. The fasteners on these 14mm studs are nylon lock nuts. They don't need lubrication for installation. Of course, clean up all the bushing mating surfaces while you're at it too. My thread chase kit doesn't include a 14 by 125, which this is, so I'm just threading a bolt all the way in a few times and lightly tapping it from 2 directions to make all the threads say hello and maybe knock loose any of that junk that might not appreciate that kind of activity. The only fastener modification is going to be a stainless steel set of M14 washers under the nuts so that I'm not grinding the back of the nuts directly into the bushing when I torque it down. The stainless washer is going to give it something to slip on and distribute that load. Nobody's instructions told me to do this, but it's easier to stick the top of the bushing spacers against the body with a smear of grease rather than repeatedly knocking them off the bushing again and again and again while trying to install it. You have to gorilla press a big heavy subframe up against 4 studs while aligning it, and you can't see any of it. Do this stacked up dry and you're going to be doing it over and over and over again. It's just, you need to do the 4 studs at first. You'll have room to insert the last 2 spacers into the ones that have the bolts going through them. Now for those 2 rear spacers, and of course the 2 brand new factory bolts ready for another 29 years of faithful service. I'm doing something weird this time in greasing the threads. The one bolt that wasn't reusable did suffer rust damage on the threads, and I want some kind of rust preventative in there to seal up anything that might be encouraging that. This is a very important part of the body that I want to protect since there's nothing wrong with it currently. You know how to install bolts and nuts. This is the easy part, finally. Only thing to be aware of here is to run them all up evenly, go 3 or 4 threads at a time, and work your way all around before you get to those last 2 or 3 threads. Pull the spacers away from the greasy chassis when you get to that part and seat them on top of their bushings correctly. Once seated, run those last couple of threads down snug and slow and grab your torque wrench. I'm not going quite as high as specified for those right now because after this is fully assembled, it will get removed again at the body shop. So for now, I'm just giving everything 64 foot-pounds. There's no torque range for the nuts. Those are just specified as 64 foot-pounds. But the big M14 bolts do, and they get between 71 and 85 normally. That's my logic right now. Over-torque nothing, and it ain't going nowhere. Volk Metalcraft makes lots of great parts like these aluminum subframe bushings for your performance DSM. If I didn't already know that I would be exceeding the load rating of the 30-year-old rubber bushings with what I'm putting back together, then I wouldn't have burned them out in the first place. And I wouldn't have done it because there are no OEM subframe bushing service parts or replacements available from anyone, anywhere, period. Don't do that. Nobody makes a urethane replacement bushing set for a 95 to 99 Eclipse either. This video covers many techniques to help you install aluminum bushings and to achieve every physical advantage that you can without modifying them. In a sense, these bushings are one size fits all, because who knows how consistent Mitsubishi is with these bosses anyway, and 30 years later, how consistent of a hole is it going to be in the subframe? These bushings have enough meat on them to fit whatever the customer might have. To prevent binding while pressing in your aluminum bushings, the most you want to go over on the bushing diameter is 7 thousandths. It would be helpful to trim 5 thousandths about a centimeter down the bushing to help you align it and to reduce the force necessary to start it and get it fully seated. Even though I had these measurement tools, a lathe, and a mat on site, I wanted to do this with the same challenges most others would face. Most of you don't have a lathe. Most of you don't have a mat. Many of you interested in this modification might not even own precision measurement tools. It would have been smart of me to measure the holes first, and much more smarterer if I had elected to powder coat this thing after I had installed the subframe bushings. I really made this a lot harder on myself than it needed to be by doing that backwards. If the video timeline's correct, it took 18 hours for me to do all of this, half of that because of the coating, but I forgive myself because this is way better than I found this thing, and it's done. According to CAPS, section 33050 is huge, and it's where the front subframe member lives. But according to the service manual, the subframe is in section 32 as part of the powertrain mounting system. It's not even part of the suspension, even though half of it is bolted to it. It's not part of the steering either, even though half of that is bolted to it too. So I'm going to break here. I'll do those in their own videos. In case you didn't know, I just dropped another half-hour video for the Patreons of a new addition to the channel that's the biggest change I've made in 6 years outside of moving into the shop. So if you missed your notification, go check it out. Your support just made a huge difference for everyone else. Thank you, Tubes, and thank you, Patreon. I'll be back with more great news and progress soon, so until next time, stay tubed!